Welcome back to Wartime Heroes. This channel is about real heroism, about the moments when ordinary men rise to extraordinary heights. Tonight's story isn't about luck. It's not about being in the right place at the right time. It's about a man who turned the skies above the Pacific into his personal battlefield and rewrote the rules of aerial combat. When the Japanese thought they owned the air, David McCampbell proved them wrong. When they came at him with overwhelming numbers, he didn't retreat. He didn't hesitate. He climbed higher, flew faster, and fought harder than anyone thought possible. If you respect that kind of determination, hit that like button. If you believe legends like this deserve to be remembered, make sure to subscribe, because this is the kind of story they don't teach in flight school, but we tell it here. Before the war, before the Hellcats, before the dogfights that would make him a legend, David McCampbell was just another small-town kid with big dreams. Born in Bessemer, Alabama in 1910, he grew up in a world where flight was still a miracle. The Wright brothers had taken to the skies just 7 years before his birth, and aviation was still something people watched in amazement at county fairs. But young David wasn't content to just watch. He wanted to fly. His path wasn't easy. His family moved around during his childhood, eventually settling in West Palm Beach, Florida, where David spent his teenage years watching seaplanes take off from the coastal waters. Every roar of an engine, every glimpse of wings cutting through the blue sky, fed something deep inside him. This wasn't just curiosity. This was calling. In 1928, at 18 years old, McCampbell made a decision that would change everything. He applied to the United States Naval Academy at Annapolis. The competition was fierce. Hundreds of young men from across the country wanted the same opportunity. But David had something different. He had focus. He had that quiet determination that separates dreamers from achievers. The academy wasn't kind to dreamers. It was 4 years of discipline, study, and pressure that broke weaker men. Plebes were hazed, tested, pushed to their limits daily. Academic standards were brutal. Physical demands were relentless. Many quit. Others were dismissed. But McCampbell endured. He wasn't the loudest in his class or the most naturally gifted, but he had something more valuable. He had persistence. Graduation came in 1933. Ensign David McCampbell stood in his dress whites, proud but uncertain about his future. The Navy was his life now, but what role would he play? The world was changing. Aviation was no longer a novelty. It was becoming essential to naval operations, and McCampbell could feel it in his bones. The future belonged to pilots. But the Navy had other plans. Fresh graduates weren't immediately sent to flight training. They served aboard surface ships first, learning seamanship, leadership, and the fundamentals of naval warfare. McCampbell was assigned to the heavy cruiser Portland, where he spent 2 years learning the basics of naval operations. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't what he dreamed of during those long nights at Annapolis, but it was necessary. Every day aboard Portland was preparation, though he didn't know it yet. He learned how ships moved in formation, how naval battles were coordinated, how split-second decisions could mean the difference between victory and defeat. He studied radar systems, communications protocols, and gunnery procedures. Most importantly, he learned to lead men under pressure. These lessons would prove invaluable when he finally got his chance to fly. 1935 changed everything. The Navy opened flight training to more officers, and McCampbell seized his opportunity. Pensacola Naval Air Station became his new home, and for the first time since childhood, David felt like he was exactly where he belonged. Flight training was intense, dangerous, and demanding. Student pilots washed out regularly. Some crashed. Others simply couldn't handle the physical and mental demands of aerial combat training. But McCampbell thrived. In the cockpit, all those years of discipline and focus paid off. He had steady hands, sharp eyes, and the kind of calm under pressure that instructors noticed immediately. Flying wasn't just something he learned. It was something he was born to do. Primary training introduced him to basic aircraft. He learned to take off, navigate, and land safely. Advanced training pushed him harder. Aerobatics, formation flying, gunnery practice, and simulated combat scenarios. Each phase eliminated more students, but McCampbell continued to excel. His instructors saw something special. This wasn't just another pilot, this was a natural. By 1938, Lieutenant McCampbell had earned his wings of gold in his first assignment as a naval aviator. He was stationed aboard the aircraft carrier Ranger, part of a new breed of naval warfare. Carriers were still experimental, still proving their worth to an old guard that believed in battleships and heavy cruisers. But forward-thinking officers recognized their potential, and McCampbell was eager to be part of this revolution. Life aboard Ranger was different from anything he'd experienced. Carriers operated as floating cities, launching and recovering aircraft around the clock. The flight deck was one of the most dangerous workplaces in the world. Planes landed at high speeds on a moving ship in all weather conditions. One mistake, one moment of inattention could be fatal. McCampbell learned carrier operations from the ground up. He mastered the controlled crash that was a carrier landing, learned to spot aircraft on crowded flight decks, and developed the split-second timing that separated successful carrier pilots from casualties. Every takeoff was a calculated risk. Every landing was a minor miracle. But this was just preparation for what was coming. Storm clouds were gathering across the Pacific. Japan was expanding aggressively, conquering territory and building a military machine that would soon challenge American naval supremacy. Intelligence reports spoke of new Japanese aircraft, highly trained pilots, and a growing carrier fleet. War was coming, and when it arrived, men like David McCampbell would be America's first line of defense. In 1940, McCampbell was promoted to lieutenant commander and given command responsibilities that would test everything he'd learned. He wasn't just a pilot anymore. He was a leader, responsible for training other pilots, developing tactics, and preparing for the conflict everyone knew was inevitable. The peacetime Navy was transforming into a wartime force, and experienced aviators like McCampbell were precious resources. The attack on Pearl Harbor changed everything. December 7th, 1941 wasn't just a date in history. It was the moment when David McCampbell's years of preparation suddenly had deadly purpose. The Japanese had struck first, crippling the Pacific Fleet and proving that carrier aviation would dominate this war. America needed its best pilots ready for combat immediately. McCampbell threw himself into wartime preparation with the intensity that had carried him through Annapolis and flight training. New aircraft were arriving from factories working around the clock. The Grumman F-6F Hellcat was bigger, faster, and more heavily armed than anything American pilots had flown before. It was specifically designed to counter the feared Japanese Zero, and McCampbell would be among the first to master its capabilities. Training intensified beyond anything the peacetime Navy had imagined. Pilots flew multiple missions daily, practicing gunnery, formation tactics, and combat maneuvers. The margin for error was gone. These skills would soon be tested against experienced Japanese pilots who had been fighting in China for years. America was playing catch-up, and men like McCampbell were the bridge between peacetime preparation and wartime reality. But preparation was ending. Orders were coming. The Pacific Fleet was rebuilding, and soon David McCampbell would face the ultimate test of everything he'd learned. The journey from small-town dreamer to naval aviator was complete. The transformation from peacetime officer to wartime leader was about to begin. By 1942, the war in the Pacific had become a brutal chess match played across thousands of miles of ocean. Japanese forces controlled most of the Central Pacific, their experienced pilots flying with the confidence of men who believed they were invincible. They had destroyed much of the American fleet at Pearl Harbor, conquered the Philippines, and pushed Allied forces back across the Pacific. But America was learning, adapting, and building. And men like David McCampbell were about to turn the tide. McCampbell received orders that would define the rest of his career. He was assigned to Air Group 15 aboard the brand-new aircraft carrier Essex. This wasn't just another assignment. Essex represented the future of American naval power, the first of a new class of carriers designed specifically for Pacific warfare. Bigger, faster, and carrying more aircraft than any carrier before her, Essex would spearhead America's counteroffensive. Air Group 15 was different from the peacetime squadrons McCampbell had known. These pilots were hungry, angry, and determined to prove that American aviation could match anything the Japanese threw at them. Many were fresh from training, eager for their first taste of combat. Others were veterans of the early Pacific battles, scarred by defeats but hardened by experience. McCampbell's job was to mold them into a fighting unit that could take on the best the Japanese had to offer. The training was relentless. Day after day, the pilots of Air Group 15 practiced the tactics that would keep them alive in combat. High-altitude intercepts, diving attacks, defensive formations, and the brutal reality of air-to-air gunnery. McCampbell pushed his men hard because he knew what waited for them in the Pacific. Japanese pilots weren't just skilled, they were fanatical, willing to die for their emperor, and they had been fighting longer than most American pilots had been flying. But McCampbell saw something in his squadron that gave him hope. These young Americans had something the Japanese didn't expect. They had innovation, flexibility, and the willingness to learn from mistakes. While Japanese pilots relied on rigid tactics and formations, American aviators were developing new approaches to aerial combat. They studied captured enemy aircraft, analyzed combat reports, and constantly refined their techniques. The Hellcat gave them the tools they needed. Unlike the lighter, more maneuverable Zero, the Hellcat was built like a flying tank. It could absorb tremendous punishment and still bring its pilot home. Its 650 caliber machine guns could tear through enemy aircraft with devastating effect. And it was fast enough to dictate the terms of engagement, allowing American pilots to attack when they had the advantage and escape when they didn't. McCampbell spent countless hours in the cockpit, not just maintaining his own skills, but understanding every capability and limitation of his aircraft. He learned to push the Hellcat to its limits, to know exactly how it would respond in every situation. This wasn't just pilot training. This was becoming one with the machine, developing the instinctive feel that separated good pilots from legendary ones. The Essex Task Force's first combat deployment took them to the Marshall Islands in early 1944. This was America's first major offensive in the Central Pacific, a direct challenge to Japanese control of the region. For McCampbell and his pilots, it was their first real test against experienced enemy aviators. The Japanese defenders weren't going to surrender easily, and they had prepared extensive defenses to stop the American advance. The night before their first combat mission, McCampbell walked the flight deck of Essex. The ship was blacked out, moving through dark Pacific waters toward an uncertain dawn. Around him, mechanics worked by shielded lights, preparing aircraft for battle. The smell of aviation fuel and hot metal filled the air. This was the moment everything had been leading to, all those years of training, all those hours of preparation. His pilots were nervous, trying to hide their fear behind bravado and dark humor. Some wrote letters home they hoped would never be mailed. Others checked and rechecked their equipment, their weapons, their emergency procedures. McCampbell understood their anxiety because he felt it too. But he also felt something else. Confidence. These men were ready, and he was ready to lead them. The briefing room was crowded and tense as intelligence officers outlined their targets. Japanese airfields needed to be neutralized before the invasion could proceed. Enemy fighters would be waiting, probably in significant numbers. Air Group 15 would face its first real combat within hours, and every man in that room knew that some of them might not return. McCampbell stood before his pilots and spoke quietly, calmly. No speeches about glory or patriotism, just practical advice about staying alive and completing the mission. Stick together. Watch your wingman's back. Don't get drawn into individual dogfights. Use your aircraft's advantages. Fight smart, not just brave. These words would echo in their minds as they climbed into their cockpits the next morning. Dawn came gray and cold over the Pacific. The task force had moved into position during the night, bringing its aircraft within range of the Marshall Islands. On Essex's flight deck, engines were warming up, filling the air with thunder. McCampbell climbed into his Hellcat, running through his pre-flight checklist with the automatic precision of thousands of hours of training. Around him, his squadron prepared for their first taste of combat. The launch was flawless. Decades of carrier operations refined into a deadly ballet. One by one, the Hellcats roared down Essex's deck and into the morning sky. McCampbell led them up through broken clouds, forming up in combat formation as they headed toward their target. Below, the Pacific stretched endlessly in all directions. Ahead, Japanese fighters were already taking off to meet them. This was the moment David McCampbell had been preparing for his entire adult life. Small-town boy, Naval Academy graduate, carrier pilot, and now combat leader. Everything he'd learned, everything he'd practiced, would be tested in the next few minutes. The Japanese pilots climbing to meet him were experienced, determined, and fighting for their homeland. But McCampbell and his men had something more. They had the best aircraft, the best training, and the unshakable belief that they were about to change the course of the war. Radio chatter crackled through McCampbell's headset as enemy contacts appeared on radar, 12 bogies climbing fast from the northeast. Japanese Zeros, their distinctive silhouettes unmistakable even at this distance. McCampbell's voice cut through the static, calm and steady. Bandits, 2 o'clock high. Stay tight, boys. Remember your training. The first engagement lasted maybe 30 seconds. McCampbell rolled his Hellcat into a diving attack, his 6 machine guns chattering as tracers streaked toward a Zero trying to climb above him. The enemy pilot was good, experienced, pulling his lighter aircraft through maneuvers that would have torn apart a lesser plane. But the Hellcat was faster, more powerful, and McCampbell had patience. He didn't chase the Zero through its acrobatics. Instead, he used his speed advantage, climbing back up, waiting for the right moment. When the Japanese pilot made his mistake, banking too sharply in a climbing turn, McCampbell was ready. A short burst from his guns perfectly aimed, and the Zero exploded in a ball of fire and smoke. His first kill. But there wasn't time to celebrate. More enemy fighters were diving on his squadron, and 2 of his wingmen were already in trouble. McCampbell pulled hard on his stick, G-forces pressing him deep into his seat as he maneuvered to help them. This was what command meant in combat, not just shooting down enemy planes, but keeping his men alive. The battle swirled across the morning sky, American Hellcats mixing it up with Japanese Zeros in a deadly dance that stretched from sea level to 20,000 feet. McCampbell was everywhere at once, calling out threats, coordinating attacks, and personally engaging any enemy pilot who got too close to his squadron. His radio discipline was perfect, his tactical decisions instant and accurate. When the smoke cleared 20 minutes later, Air Group 15 had shot down 8 Japanese fighters without losing a single Hellcat. McCampbell had personally accounted for 2 kills, but more importantly, he'd brought all his men home alive. The intelligence reports were right. The Hellcat could outfight the Zero when flown properly, and American pilots were learning fast. Back aboard Essex, the debriefing was electric with excitement and adrenaline. Young pilots who'd been terrified hours earlier now talked rapidly about their first combat, comparing notes, analyzing mistakes, planning improvements. McCampbell listened more than he spoke, filing away lessons that would keep them alive in future engagements. But this was just the beginning. The Marshall Islands campaign would last weeks with daily combat missions against increasingly desperate Japanese defenders. Each sortie brought new challenges, new tactics, new opportunities to prove that American naval aviation had finally come of age. That first combat mission over the Marshall Islands was just the beginning of David McCampbell's transformation from skilled pilot to legendary warrior. Over the coming months, he would shoot down 34 enemy aircraft, become the Navy's top ace, and earn the Medal of Honor for a single day when he downed 9 Japanese planes in one mission. But his greatest achievement wasn't the kills or the medals. It was proving that ordinary men, through dedication, training, and unbreakable will, could rise to meet any challenge. From small-town Alabama dreamer to America's greatest naval aviator, McCampbell showed us that heroes aren't born. They're forged through years of preparation, tested in moments of truth, and remembered for the courage they showed when everything was on the line. Thank you for watching Wartime Heroes. If this story inspired you, hit that like button and subscribe, because there are more heroes waiting to have their stories told.